You're listening to Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy. Ron Bennington speaks with the friends and stand-ups who knew the beloved comedian.
Christians, they want you to go see movies like March of the Penguins. They say, well, the penguins are monogamous. Well, first of all, penguins are monogamous for 1 year, one mating season. Anybody could fuck the same person for 1 year. Especially if every person looked exactly like every other person.
For the next hour, the life of Greg Giraldo will be examined and discussed.
I was in a subway the other day. This guy screams across the tracks. He goes, "Yo, Monica! Yo, Monica! Yo, you got AIDS, yo!" And I thought, wow, that's how they tell you?
This is Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy.
There's terrorism stories on the news. You know, my son is watching it. And he's like, but Daddy, how come the bad men hate us so much? Isn't that heartbreaking, man? I almost started crying, you know? Because he's 18. Now, what kind of moron am I raising?
And here's your host, Ron Bennington.
Hi, I am Ron Bennington, and this is Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy. We're going to be talking to literally some of the funniest people on the planet about the life and times of Greg Giraldo. People like Colin Quinn, Dave Attell, Jim Gaffigan, Tom Papa, Lisa Lampanelli, Jim Norton, Nick DiPaolo, Robert Kelly, Vinnie Brand, Rich Voss, Jim Florentine, Andy Kindler, as well as Matt Balaker, an author of the upcoming book about Greg Giraldo. And this is just going to scratch the surface of the life of this brilliant comedian and very complicated guy. It's always interesting, I think, when you see somebody whose talent that you admire so much, and maybe the last guy in the room to get that is the person with that talent. But I can tell you this, just having these kind of people talking about him and the fact that there's a new biography that will be coming out on him will just help you know that even though he's been gone now for a while, his legacy in his life and hopefully his work catches on. So let this just scratch the surface. If you were a fan, remember to go back and check out his work. And if you're young and you weren't there for when Greg was doing his work, go back and take a look at it. Right off the bat, let's talk to Jim Gaffigan about his early career. And he and Greg kind of got started at the same time.
You know, when you start stand-up comedy, you have your typical awkward experience, but then you usually pair up with a like-minded person. And so you have this comedy buddy. And so my first comedy, or maybe not my first, but my initial comedy buddy was Greg Giraldo. We both started at the same time. I met him. We were both wearing suits. We were at this open mic called Cold Waters, which was Gladys Simon's. Before she had Gladys's at Hamburger Harry's, she had it at Cold Waters, and now she's at the comic strip. She's still going. And I met Greg Giraldo, and he was a lawyer, and I was an account guy in advertising. And back then there was, it was mostly people doing stand-up were mentally insane. And Greg kind of looked at each other like, well, you're not insane. And it had nothing to do with us being in suits. It just was. And I remember him doing material, and I was like, that's kind of funny. And he actually approached me, and he was like, hey, you're kind of funny. And so we ended up being, buddies, and I knew him for, we both did Caroline's Comedy Hour with Bonnie McFarlane. That's where we met Bonnie. And we kind of struggled together because at that time, the last thing New York City needed were two more white guys. And even though Greg is Hispanic, but he's, he was just another guy, so we would go out to Long Island together, and we would go to Chuckles and occasionally Governor's, and And Greg was the one who got me stage time because he was from Queens, and I look like John Tesh to them, so they would kind of talk to Greg, and Greg would kind of vouch for me. So, but we were buddies, and the amazing thing of the story is that Greg was, I would be the drunk one, but like when we started, I remember Greg really wanted to be, like, Greg's comedy idol was Brian Regan, and my comedy idol was Dave Attell. And somewhere in between, we shifted. And I ended up more like Brian Regan, and he ended up more like Dave Attell.
Damn, I love that story. That is just hilarious to me that they switched spots somewhere early in their career. This is Jim Florentine talking about his early days with Greg Giraldo.
I started doing comedy probably 2 years before him. He's doing comedy like 4 months. He's emceeing and I'm featuring, and he's blowing me off the stage. That's how good he was at 4 months. Like, he was just such a great comic, always coming up with new material, good dude, and just, I don't know. He had a sitcom. He was only doing comedy like 2 years in a sitcom on ABC. It only lasted a year. I forget what it was called. I mean, he was in LA. I mean, his career was just right from the beginning. But then I guess later on, with Comedy Central, he had like 6 or 7 different pilots, and for some reason, none of them ever got picked up. Like, he was always the next guy to just get to that next level. But as a comic, he was genius. He would kill every show. You know what I mean? And the roast he was amazing on. But for some reason, later on, the TV thing didn't work for him. I don't know. They were always trying different projects for him, and it just didn't click. He was Comedy Central's boy. He was with my manager, Rick Dorfman, at the time, too. So we were close, me, him, and Rick, and then, his management, and then Greg, obviously. But Greg opened a lot of doors for me because he was so popular. He was getting so much stuff that my manager was like, hey, I got this other guy, Jim Florentine. Why don't you take a look at him? Which is great. And they're like, okay, but we really want Greg. He's like, well, give Jim a little part. Sure. And no problem. I'm like, beautiful. He's opening doors for me.
One thing I love to hear about is comedians at the very early stages. And this is Tom Papa talking about that time in their careers.
On June 12th, 1993, I did my very first stand-up set. I drove my little car in from New Jersey, and if you had a couple friends that would pay to sit in the audience and drink, you could get on stage. I went to the New York Comedy Club, which was in a different location than it is now. It was on top of this like cowboy bar. And I walked in, and this guy, Gary, was on stage. There was no one in the audience. My friends went in, and there was like 3 people in the audience. And my friends went in. There was like now 7 people in the audience. And it looked kind of pathetic. And sitting there waiting to go on was Greg Giraldo, a young, very nervous, very sweaty Greg Giraldo who'd been doing stand-up for only like 6 months. And I know that because I immediately started talking to him, and I was trying to be cool. I was like, this won't be bad. It won't be that scary. It'll be fine. And then I saw him, and he was like shaking like a leaf, and he was, talking 100 miles an hour like Greg always did. And this is cool. It's good. And there's not much of an audience, but it's going to be good. And nice to meet you. Where are you from? And he went up and did his thing. It was hilarious. I went up and was like, okay. But we immediately became best of friends from that point on. And there was a period where I actually had some personal stuff going on and had to stop going to the open mics and stuff. And I would be in my day job in this little advertising agency, and Giraldo would call me every day. Dude, what are you doing? Where have you been? It's been 2 months. What are you doing? You gotta come do stand up. What are you gonna do? Advertising? What are you gonna do? Advertising your whole life? You can't do advertising. And he was kind of confirming his leap, which was leaving like this amazing law career that he could have had after coming out of Harvard Law. And he had just made the leap and wasn't doing it anymore. And he's like, well, if you stay and do advertising in this tiny crummy agency, then I definitely screwed up. He was the best.
Tom Papa talking about his early stand-up career and meeting Greg Giraldo very early on. I always get the biggest kick out of these kind of stories. Here's one of the funniest people on the planet, Nick DiPaolo.
Greg Giraldo, one of my favorite. What a shame. This is how I know how good a comic he is. He's been gone quite a few, almost 7 years now? Around that? But I still see his albums ahead of mine on iTunes all the time. I mean, he was that good. And first time I met him, I was at not the first time I met him. I think it was the first time I met him. Catch a Rising Star in Princeton, New Jersey. It's at the Hyatt Hotel. And I come off stage and he's hitting on my date, who's now my wife. But it was so funny. And he was like blushing about it. He didn't know. Like, I don't know if he didn't know or whatever. But I remember calling him on his. But I remember having to follow him. And he was young comic. And I'm like, Jesus, this kid's going to be a pain in the ass for the next couple nights because he was really funny and smart and just what you guys know him as. And it's such a shame, you know.
Nick DiPaolo talking about Greg Giraldo and meeting him very early on. And this is kind of a class of comedians that came in more or less around the same time. But here's a guy who was doing this probably 40 years before them, Rich Voss.
Years ago, before anybody knew anybody, I was working for Lauderdale, the comic strip, and he came in and did a guest spot, and that was before anybody had anything. I thought he was great. Not only was it was smart, funny, and challenging. You know what I mean? It was smart, funny, and clever. He was a great comic. He was smart and funny. On roast, he was great. He was just great. That's why they put him first. He would open the show, and they know, to start off on those Comedy Central roasts, him going first, he would get the crowd, and the people would go, oh, this is going to be a good roast. So, you start, especially on a roast, you always start off with one of the strongest roasters you can. Like on a regular stand-up show, they put, on the road, they put the local host, whatever, the middle, and then the headliner. But in a roast, you got to have a headliner like that up front. I loved watching him do roasts. I loved it. I thought he was quick and clever, and that's what's great about a good roast is when you don't see the punchline coming and the cleverness of it, and he definitely had that down. It's sad that when you get guys like him, Patrice, Mike DiStefano, Mike D, all three of them would have exploded even to another level. All of them, Mike, but obviously Patrice, Giraldo, they all, it's like Hicks. When Hicks died, he was 33. He wasn't even coming into his own practically. At 33, Hedberg, all of them. Oh, I don't know. Only the good die young. I think I came up with that. I don't know if I've ever heard that, only the good die young, but I'm pretty sure I came up with that. Only the good die young. I'm gonna see if I could write something about that. Only the good die young. That's a good quote. Anyhow, that's all I got. I mean, he also could, give some of his tour dates or plug some of his CDs, but why would he do that on a Giraldo documentary? That would be, what is he, the president? Is he a narcissist? No, I'm not like that. I'm not going to say go get Rich Voss 5 on iTunes or Still Empty Inside or 141 IQ, because why would I want to make this about me when it's about such a clever guy that probably would have loved my last CD? Well, we had that kind of, stuff in common, clever.
Rich Voss, sadly speaking from his heart and showing exactly who he is. It always is interesting in comedy because a lot of people, it's the only thing that they could have done. And they were either, school cut-ups or young truants. But Giraldo actually had this Ivy League background. He went to Columbia right after high school and then on to Harvard Law. So it's really unique and really strange that what he decided to do with those degrees is to do stand-up. And this is Jim Gaffigan talking about that.
He was so talented that I think this business is very confusing for, brilliant people like Greg, who is this, this amazing story of his parents were, immigrants, and he got a scholarship to go to a great school in high school in Manhattan, and then he, went to Columbia, and then he went to Harvard Law, and that the fact that the entertainment industry is not this meritocracy was kind of confusing for Greg, because you have to understand, stand-up comedy of all entertainment industries actually is a meritocracy. You're either good or you're not good. I mean, there's some kind of, smoke and mirrors, but you either can do the job or you can't. And so I think it was very frustrating for Greg to be this skilled, likable guy and, encounter frustration and disappointment when he had won at everything in his life. So, but it's really interesting to, obviously the ending was very tragic, and the Greg that, at the ending was the last version of Greg I'd ever imagined that I'd encounter, that from that first day of meeting him or from being his comedy buddy for so many years. I mean, I remember one time he came in from Queens to pick me up to go to Easter at his parents' house, and I was too hungover to go. So it was like, it doesn't, the ending doesn't match the story of how I knew Greg.
Jim Gaffigan talking about Greg Giraldo. And, we talked a little bit there about his background as far as being an Ivy Leaguer. But he was also, of course, very much a street guy. And at that time, the Comedy Cellar and the table in there was, you had to kind of defend yourself every night. And that's what Colin Quinn later put together as Tough Crowd. But this is Nick DiPaolo talking about some of those Comedy Cellar days.
I'd see him at the Comedy Cellar. He'd come in and he'd bounce in and he'd have his leather jacket on, and he'd make up some Italian word. He'd see me and he'd go, "Hey, guys, at each," and would hug some made up bullshit Italian word that doesn't even exist, And then would sit down and talk politics, and he'd laugh at me and DiPaolo, why do you hate women? And I go, what are you talking about? I go, you look at the look on your face. I never met anybody so miserable that, in their life. And but Manny would come in, the late great Manny Dwarman, who owned the Comedy Cellar, and he loved Giraldo, and would talk about what happened in the news that day.
I love that story, and I love the fact that Greg had ended up finding his tribe with those guys at the Comedy Cellar. Here's Nick talking more about those days.
Everybody could relate to him. So he was just hitting his stride too. He was just getting good. But then one night, another Greg Giraldo, him and Patrice didn't exactly love each other. And I remember being at the Comedy Cellar one night, and they get into a shouting match. Giraldo's at one end of the restaurant. This is a full Olive Tree Cafe restaurant. Patrice is at the other end, and they start having words about something, like blacks and Hispanics will do. Natural enemies, I was told by Colin. But I think Giraldo might have been a little drunk, and Patrice, they start yelling at each other. And I'm sitting there enjoying it, but there's people, picture this, as a family's eating and shit. And Giraldo, oh, fuck you, Patrice, you fucking... And I had not seen that side of Giraldo before, But it was sad. So you'd see him on stage at the Cellar working out. Those Tough Crowd days, that was the heyday down at the Comedy Cellar. We'd all support each other. We're all doing new stuff and all cheering each other on and stuff. And I had heard about Greg's, drug use. Never really saw it until one night he came in and he was out of his mind. He was downstairs, right where people are funneling in to the Comedy Cellar, that little hallway, and he smashed his head against one of the pictures on the wall. And he was mumbling shit, and I helped him up, and we helped him upstairs, and I had always heard that he had a problem, and that's the only time I had witnessed it, and it was horrible. And I hear him now on the radio, and and I've told this before because I've been interviewed about him many times, but I'll hear one of his bits and go, oh, I have a good tag for him or whatever. And you forget. Same with Patrice. I want to text him or whatever, and you just forget for a second.
Those guys were so absolutely hilarious and combustible. And the fact that Colin put that show together with all of them, which was just moving them out of the cellar and the table and on to Comedy Central. Go back and look at some of the material. Don't make me tell you how to use Google or YouTube. Your kids, you know what to do. But the material lives on, and also there's going to be an upcoming book that will delve into this way deeper. But we wanted to just give you a taste. And this is Robert Kelly, the very, very funny Robert Kelly, talking about those times when the Comedy Cellar crew moved over into Tough Crowd.
Me, Greg, Norton, and Patrice. We were at the table when Patrice got kicked out of the cellar. I remember it was me, Greg, and we're all having Greg was talking to Manny and Norton. They were having a conversation, and then Patrice had said something to Manny, and he fucking some really disrespectful, and then Manny was fucking flipped out. I remember Greg was sticking up for Patrice, and Manny started snapping on Greg a little bit, and then Norton was sticking up for Patrice, and Norton wound up leaving. He kicked himself out. It was a fucking crazy night. But of course, a couple of days later, we're all back at the table laughing about it. Yeah, Greg was there every night, man. Yeah, he was one of the regulars on Tough Crowd, and then he got his own show after that. I mean, Comedy Central fucking, he would always murder, man. He would, you always think that I would do Tough Crowd once in a while. No, I wasn't a regular, but, Colin was real nice to me. But, you think you wrote all this stuff, and then you do your thing at the end, and then you hear Giraldo's, and it was like a hot 5 minutes that he would write every time he was on there. He was just one of the best on the show.
I had the chance to sit down and talk to Colin Quinn, not just about Greg, but also that entire Tough Crowd crew, which to this day, I'm surprised they got this show on TV. And this would make a great documentary and probably even a fantastic movie if the right person could write it and direct it. But this is the great Colin Quinn talking about those days.
That's great. It's great. Actually, a guy's writing a book about him. I'm reading it right now, and I'm supposed to do the forward, which means I was supposed to do the forward like a month and a half ago. I got busy. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, Greg was the guy. Greg was sort of like the nicest hybrid of what Tough Crowd was. You know what I mean? In the ideal sense, in that he was so funny, but he was informed, but he tried to see, like, he was kind of like, he could go either way. Like, you couldn't tell what his political leaning was because he would just go back and forth all the time like a normal human being would if our society was not just this, back in red and blue Republican. He was kind of like, he'd go in and out each day,
But he was educated, but also a street guy. Right?
Yeah, so he grew up poor in Queens. I think his father's like... He was a Colombian immigrant. I think he was like a busboy or something. He worked in a restaurant. And then Greg was like he got into Regis High School, which is this elite Catholic high school in New York that, you have to get these great grades. It's like the Harvard of Catholic schools. And then he got into Columbia. I mean, he got into Harvard itself and then Columbia Law School. So he was like a brilliant guy, yeah.
And what was it that he fulfilled for you on that show? What did he bring that you didn't have without him?
He brought like that the fact that he was always prepared. You know what I mean? He actually had the big famous fight with Dennis Leary because Dennis Leary was accusing him of being prepared. But that was Greg. He went to, you don't go to Regis, Harvard, and Columbia by going, I'll wing it when I get in the test today, And he always brought the middle. I don't want to say the middle ground because it sounds like it's not funny in the middle, but he would be ironically, kind of cynically, attacking both sides and whatever he said. So he'd be saying something, he'd be mocking what he was talking about, but then it would be an almost sarcastic undertones. He was making fun of everything,
That piece with him and Leary was so funny to me because you saw how quickly it went from being a comedy show to Two Guys on the Corner.
Yes.
Like, it literally came close to being physical.
Yeah, no, it looked like a fight. You know what I mean? And I was like, oh man, because and you know, Leary takes a lot of grief for that one, and I'm not denying the grief he takes. I'm just saying that the one thing that nobody realizes is that we were reshooting. It even says in the shoot, glad we reshot this. And afterwards, I go, I'll cut that if you want. He goes, no, leave it. It's good TV.
Yeah.
So at least Leary left it up.
And it was good TV, and Leary was I think that people would side with Greg because he was the underdog.
That's
but they
right.
were both like, a dog looking in the mirror. I mean, you could see that those guys are cut from the same cloth.
Yeah, exactly. They were both fuming mad. And I think it was that Dennis, I don't think Dennis understood what Greg, like I said, Greg was being sarcastic. And Dennis didn't realize so whatever he said about North Korea, I forget what the line was. And then Leary's like, oh, yeah, right. And then Greg's like, yeah, you didn't get it. I was being sorry. And then it was just ugly.
Yeah. And he'd stepped on him, you know what I mean? Like, Jordan was going, somebody stepped on him. And that was the whole thing. But that Tough Crowd had that all the time, right? I mean, that was always on the outline that this thing could become less than fun.
Sure. I mean, a lot of times it was ugly,
Yeah.
But that was the whole point. I was trying to make it like, oh, everybody likes real. Like, I wanted to keep it authentic, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I was trying not to make it so that, like, people would try to write jokes, but only, like, they get the topics like an hour early. So a lot of it was improv, and I wanted it to be, like, authentic. So it's not always laughs, or it's not always going to be laughs. Sometimes it got serious, I was trying to make it, like, moment in the moment.
Colin Quinn talking about Tough Crowd and, of course, Greg Giraldo's role in that. And I always love the fact that Greg just seemed to be just consuming this information every day and then filtering it out, either through comedy or sometimes just his own point of view. There's a book on Greg Giraldo's life that's being written right now, and this is the author, Matt Balaker, talking about Greg on Tough Crowd.
He had a likability where he could insult someone and just sort of smile about it, and you wouldn't think it was too personal. And I think because of that, he was on probably, I think, more than any other panelist. And the network apparently wanted him on more, but there's still the dynamic of you can't have him on every episode, and there are other comedians to have in there. But I think his insights, I mean, after a post 2001 9/11. Added an intelligence that, I mean, there are plenty of other smart comedians. I think Nick DiPaolo is really brilliant, Jim Norton, Colin Quinn. I mean, I think all the regulars were very heady, but he kind of took it to a level that I think people across the country maybe didn't see initially, who weren't there in their ground zero. And then kind of gave Tough Crowd, which kind of had a little bit of a blue collar edge to it, almost a Daily Show feel, because he brought his Ivy League pedigree without losing his brashness.
This is Jim Norton talking about Tough Crowd.
Doing Tough Crowd with him. Here's the problem with doing Tough Crowd with him. We spent so much time together. You kind of felt bad about your own writing because Giraldo was always prepared. Dennis Leary gave him shit for that and fucking learned to rue the day he did. But Giraldo was a really prepared, funny dude. Like, he cared about being funny. He cared about being original and about being topical. I remember seeing him at the Comedy Cellar one night, and he was walking off stage, and I was waiting to go on, and he goes, "Man, I don't fucking write enough. I don't do new material." He was complimenting me on something. He's like, "You always do new stuff. I'm not doing." And it's like, are you out of your fucking mind? Like, you're always doing new shit. But he didn't see. It's weird. You don't see yourself like other people see you. Greg didn't understand how much new shit he was doing and how respected he was, I think, by the other comedians.
It's truly a crazy and interesting and fun show, Tough Crowd. Go back. There's a lot of the stuff on YouTube, but still pretty mind-blowing today that these guys were able to get together and talk about the news that way. And it infuriated a lot of people because you know how we are. We'd like just to know one side or the other, and whoever disagrees with us is a terrible person. But there was really funny stuff on there. And every once in a while, somebody would say something that might change your mind. This is Nick DiPaolo talking about working with Greg on Tough Crowd.
I thought Giraldo gave what I do for a living credibility. When a guy is a Harvard lawyer and he quits to be a stand-up comic, It just gives us some credibility. It's not all dummies doing this, not all pot smoking, fucking lazy. 98% of us. But he always brought sanity to the table. He always saw both sides like a true liberal would, you know. Just very smart. And then tough crowd. I remember him coming into the green room one day, and I got my notebook. I'm jotting something down about 10 minutes before showtime. And he goes, DiPaolo, so fucking competitive. And I go, well, I don't know. I said I didn't do this shit last night. We got the topic or whatever. So I'd say about 5 minutes later, I'm going down the stairs, getting ready to go to the studio. Who's under the staircase, jotting his shit down? Mr. Harvard himself. Yeah, so competitive. But he was just funny in again, Harvard, smart enough to go to Harvard, one of the best high schools in New York. Just a brilliant guy, but he could be that every guy too, you know?
That's Nick DiPaolo talking about Greg Giraldo and the fact that he loved that they had a guy in their midst that was an Ivy League guy. This is Nick talking more about Tough Crowd.
His shit was so goddamn funny. And like I said, I don't even think we saw the best of him, you know? But, yeah, sorely missed. And like I said, everybody liked him. People weren't kind of a highbrow, but he was but he could do that every guy stuff too. That's why he's such a good fit on Tough Crowd. And of course, his showdown with Dennis Leary, which everybody talks about, which was just, you know, I love both those guys. I'm from Boston. I like Leary a lot. And so I was just sitting there going, oh, Jesus. And that's all. And you know what? That's all everybody talks about. And then, Geraldo Rivera had me on a couple of years ago. He had a show on Sunday nights to interview me about Greg. And Geraldo Rivera literally thought that Greg took his name, Geraldo. Greg Giraldo. As her, he thought that was. I go, no, that's his real name. Do you believe it? So, and he goes, yeah, but he died in a hotel, you know. And I couldn't think of what to say. I go, yeah, that was sad, but you know what I should have said was, yeah, that's where comedians and musicians die a lot of times, you know. But he brought out he introduced him as when we were talking about that segment on Geraldo, he called him he said, Greg Giraldo, an insult comic. And I go, don't say that. That doesn't do, first of all, I hate that term for anybody. I don't know where that came from. Rickles might be the only one it fits. But it started with the roast. You started to hear that insult comic. And that does not define Giraldo by any means. That's not what he was at all. He was really good at the roast. And it's funny, us guys that did those roasts got labeled as like insult comic, which really, and I remember pointing that out to Geraldo Rivera going, he wasn't that doesn't do him justice, that label. So, but yeah, great guy and a great comic. And what can you say?
I love Nick talking about the fact that you can get branded so quickly. People want to put you into a box, but going back over Greg Giraldo's work, and there's plenty of it out there for you to check out and keep alive. But there doesn't seem to be any one center. He did so many things. And some of that I think even frustrated him. But he made a lot of this stuff look easy. And again, I want to point this out. The funniest people that you can imagine are sitting around today talking about him with great admiration. And this is one of the best of all time, Dave Attell.
Well, I knew Greg for years, like coming up through the New York comedy scene, but we worked together many times. But I guess we did do a special together. It was Greg, myself, Dane Cook, and Sean Rouse, and I hosted it. And when Greg went on for his, part of the special, there was this fire alarm that went off, and he rolled with it. He just totally made it part of his act, and it was great because, that's what you're supposed to do. And it already was kind of a rough show to begin with, so it really fit in, if you ask me. And that's what I loved about Greg, because he was, good at everything. He was good at both topical stuff, working the crowd, super smart, balls of steel, and that was really what separated him from a lot of other comics. He really never pulled any punches, and he never took the easy road either. whether it was in life or on stage. So, I guess at the end we all pay for it. But he was and is probably one of the templates of like what you should be as a comic. Greg had some of the best topical stuff out there. I mean, like he just could run the gambit. He had like great topical stuff, and he had like some super awesome just sex stuff. Like he really knew how to do it. And I guess the Civil War documentary had come out, by Ken Burns, and it was all about those letters, and everybody did their parody on it. So he did his thing about like the letters that are being sent now, because no one knows how to write anymore, and no one really is poetic. Like these beautiful letters from the past. Now it's like, don't fuck anybody while I'm here in the desert, instead of desert. Like, I always love that line. It really always makes me laugh. But I'll say one thing. Like, I was on Tough Crowd once or twice. Greg was a regular, and in order to be a regular there, you really had to hold your own. And, like, Greg and Patrice, who are both, no longer with us, they were definitely the ones that, like, when you saw both of them on there, you knew that was a great episode.
Dave Attell talking about Greg Giraldo. And I'll go back to say it's tough to find the center of Greg's creativity, because some of these things that he's most known for, that he did so well, he personally didn't feel like it reflected upon his act or his work, but he was just great at them. This is Jim Norton talking about his skills.
He was a great comedian. I mean, and on those roasts, I mean, he literally set the bar for those roasts, because he was a fucking machine and he was vicious. Like, he came out and really just knocked people's teeth out right up front and let people know this is what this roast is going to be. So I miss him a lot. And then right after him was Patrice a year later. It's like, I can't believe it. We talk about tough crowd reunions. You can't do a tough crowd reunion without Patrice and Greg. Maybe without Greg, maybe without Patrice, but not without both of them. There was just too much of those guys in that show. Too much of their heart and souls they were part of the fabric of that show. Colin was, of course, the host, and I was a big part of it, and so was Nick and Keith. But you cannot do it without both of those guys. It just wouldn't feel right. It'd be too big of a gap. So yeah, he's missed, man.
Jim Norton talking about Greg Giraldo and his skills. If you go back to those roasts, I think the three people that really exploded off of it was Jeff Ross, Lisa Lampanelli, and Greg. And when you went to see Jeff Ross or Lisa Lampanelli, you kind of got the people from those roasts. If you were a fan of the roast and you went out and saw their show, you kind of got more of them. But if you were a fan of Greg on the roast and went to see his show, you didn't exactly get that guy from the roast. You got Greg Giraldo in his stand-up mode. And again, one of those complicated things about him and his creativity. This is Lisa Lampanelli talking about Greg Giraldo.
He never was particularly nice to me, so I never really talked to him much. He was a real dented can. We're all dented cans, but unfortunately he had, turned it on himself. And a lot of those guys didn't give me any time of day. And Jeff Ross has always been super nice to me. That's like the exception. But like all those guys on those roasts, they're consumed with themselves. I get it. Me too. But most male comics haven't been particularly nice. Norton's an exception. He was always nice, but he was so friggin' horny and weird that I was like, oh my God, I'm scared of him. Like, I didn't think he'd ever try to rape me or anything, because I wasn't rapeable at that time. But I mean, thought he was too weird. But yeah, a lot of those guys weren't really nice. And I think it was now that I realized it wasn't me, it was them. They had their internal demons. Of course, Greg Giraldo is going to be nice to a big, open-hearted, mushy-hearted, white, fat bitch. You know what I mean? Like, why should you be? Like, I'm not open to you, you're not going to be open to me. So I now try to be more open to attract the type of person who would be wouldn't have been open to me in the past.
And this is Robert Kelly talking about Greg.
I appreciated Greg, a lot. Just before he died, I started listening to his comedy, and I was like, holy shit. Like, he did a lot of the work. He's one of those guys who was kind of really funny, but he did all the work too. Because I remember I'd be on a Tough Crowd with him, and he'd have all these notes, and Patrice would make fun of him. Fucking notes, just be funny. But he wrote funny shit, and he performed it. And he was one of the best at it. And, you know, I don't know, it's kind of, it sucks because it was weird because we were kind of becoming friends and he was trying to get sober. And, you know, I've been sober and I kind of reached out, like, if you ever need me. And, you know, and he didn't reach out, but he was, you know, also like, yeah, that's cool, man. Thanks. Hey, what's up? And, you know, it's funny. Patrice's girlfriend just walked by. Patrice's wife just walked by me today. That was fucking weird. Yeah, I mean, but I only have 2 CDs on my phone. The only comedy CDs I have is Patrice O'Neal's and Greg Giraldo's. So every once in a while, in my car, the only 2 comics that come up is Patrice or Greg, and not because they're both passed. You know, I actually had Greg's on before that, so you know his bit about the fat kid with wheels on his sneakers is just how fucking he could take something and just rip it apart and then just rant about it. And it was just so on the money, so hilarious. You know, it's just amazing. One of the funniest guys ever, and it's sad that I didn't get to appreciate him more when we were hanging out at the table.
Again, it's about the comedy. This is Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy, and if you get the opportunity, make the opportunity to go back and check out his work, because if this show is about anything, it's about keeping some of this work alive. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. This is Robert Kelly talking more about Giraldo's material.
His material is just, man, I mean, you can't, it was, the reason I like it, if you listen to it, it's, you know, when a comic invents their own style, you know, it's kind of, you know, a little bit of that, a little bit of this is when they really come into their own. And he had that, you know, his bits were very topical. He could be topical. He could be personal, and he would put it into these rants and just go on, and it just never stopped. It was like I loved him because he stepped on the gas and he didn't let up until he said goodnight. You know, there was jokes per minute and just crushing the whole time he was up there. Really aggressive, ranty, topical, political, you know, personal shit. Just kind of all of it, which is great. You know, I mean, just one of the best. And I mean, he's a fucking lawyer. You didn't even need to do this shit. You know, he had a law degree. He was a highly intelligent guy, but he was also cool as shit. You know, he wore a leather fucking wristband, and tattoos, and just a cool dude.
This is the incredibly funny Andy Kindler, who he and Greg, and this is one of those odd things in life, they ended up as judges on Last Comic Standing, which I thought was a very funny and bizarre place to see them both in. But this is Andy, who, you know, many comedians admire and have nothing but respect for, talking about Greg and his material.
He was always hilarious, but he went through such a change where his act became so much more real and so much more showing all the different levels to himself that, you know, not every comic is able to do that. You know, there are a lot of comics, I'm sure, who were talented who never continued because whatever, they got disgusted or whatever, they were frustrated. But he went through such a change as a comic, and it's really cool when you can see that in somebody. I've seen that in a lot of comics, you know, because I'm old now. But I see comics, you know, who started out, and I've seen a couple comics. I thought, I don't see how they're ever going to be funny, and they became funny. And so it's like he was, in that sense, like a true comedian. And I always just felt like he could have been a lawyer, he could have been all these things, but he absolutely became a comic. That's pretty brave. I say I could be a lawyer, but I don't think I could be. You know, it's like there really is a risk involved when you know you could make astronomical sums of money, or do what you love. And so I just thought he was very brave and also very sweet. And I loved hanging around with him. He's one of those people, like, you really wanted to hang around with him more. You know, you just wanted to be with him. You know, I think he's a true comedian. I mean, it's just like, either you're meant to, I hate to make it like you're meant to do it or you're not meant to do it. Mostly the goal of a comedian is to take what you had off stage before you even were a comic and then go on stage and become the onstage version of that. And so I think the great comics in general all go through, all comics. I look at my early stuff, thank God there weren't a lot of cameras then, because it was kind of probably pretty awful. And so, and of course, then you have someone like Chappelle who was like brilliant kind of from the beginning. But I think that because Greg was, and this is what I mean by like so highly intelligent in the sense that he was a sensitive person who was feeling things and extremely bright and insightful about it. So like he would talk to me about the program or whatever. He would talk to me, and we had never spent that much time together, but he would talk to me and you'd see, oh my God, he has got almost like an encyclopedic mind, and he's got a lot of things that he's thinking about. So I think that he probably was too young when he first got his first break because, you're always too young. And so, and he decided he just couldn't have been comfortable not developing everything that, a great comic is meant to develop. And so that's why I think it was. I also think he came up during a time period which I wasn't around much for, but there was kind of that crossover between the alternative movement in L.A. and New York and the stuff that Attell was doing and Giraldo were doing. They were like, I'm from New York, but I started comedy in L.A., and I never related to the stereotypical tough guy New York thing. But the way Giraldo approached it, he was more like I'd say like a guy's guy than me, and more obviously he's been in fights, so he's a tougher guy than me. But he had such a depth, and that was going around. I think that was around the same time the alternative movement was happening. So I think it was a good time period in comedy for him to be able to develop, and then himself, and then of course there is nothing funnier than his lines on the roast. Might be the funniest jokes of all time, just like pound for pound, word for word, attack, that crisp attack, the pain of the joke. It's almost like people go, oh, I knew him from the roast. Well, the reason why was like he was like the essence of what a roasting thing would be. Like he knows the person he's roasting, or he has something important to say beyond the slam.
Andy Kindler talking about Greg Giraldo. And once again, here's Tom Papa.
One time, like towards the end, he got really into boating. He loved boating. And it was such a hopeful thing because he was always so super intelligent and super fraught with anxiety. And, that's where all the self-medicating, I think, came from. He was just one of those guys whose brains never really turned off. And but he was just, filled with love for his family, and he just loved life, and he got into boating. And it was like this real bright spot because he loved it. He would go out and stuff, and then he got his own boat they could take the kids out on and go out into the ocean. And it's such a funny thing whenever you have a comedian, especially like a real New York comedian like a Giraldo, who you normally just see in mostly black late at night in a club or at a bar, to see him out on the sea in the sunshine is always kind of jarring. But he took me out in it, and we went to Brooklyn to get on the boat, and then we went out, and he was so filled with life. He was so happy, and he was so grateful that comedy had brought us to this point. Like, we were successful, and we're now like on a boat that he bought, and we're going around Manhattan, and we were just so excited and so like kid-like, and it seemed like everything was going to be okay. And we thought, and we had this thing like, could we just go around Manhattan? Like, could we just? I mean, it's an island, right? It's technically an island, and we had no boating like know-how or anything. We're just like, yeah, we go up the East River. We're like dodging like other boats and big planks, and we got to the very top, the tip of northern Manhattan, and we're like, okay, this is where I guess we would go around, and there was like this tiny little door, and like a little like a toll bridge kind of thing, and a little hut connected to it, and we just pulled up and it's closed, and we're like, oh, I guess we can't go all the way around New York. Oh well, we learned it, and then ding ding ding, all of a sudden this little man in the thing opened up the gate, and we're like, he's letting us through. He's going to let us through. Full speed ahead, Greg. He hit it. We were so happy that we had done a full circle. We were actually able to do it. It was just so amazing. And I just always remember that whenever I think of Greg, and whenever I come back here and running around New York, especially in the summer and stuff, just thinking of me and Greg tooling around like two comedians a comedian shouldn't be on a boat, a comedian shouldn't be in water. But for that little brief moment there, we were just really, really enjoying life. Yeah, I miss him.
Tom Papa talking about a boat trip with Greg Giraldo. And I have no idea how a guy from Jersey and a guy from Queens have never heard of the Harlem River before. But, comedians. There's going to be a book out on Greg's life. And part of why we wanted to do this was just scratch the surface a little bit to let you hear so many of these great comedians and the way they felt about Greg Giraldo, not just as a person, and in some cases even as in spite of as a person, but as an artist. And he was that. This is Matt Balaker, one of the authors of the new biography, talking about Greg Giraldo.
There's a lots of things that surprised me. One, he played soccer at Columbia. I didn't know that. And the fact that he actually, while he was working as an attorney at Skadden Arps, before he kind of delved into stand-up comedy, he would periodically leave and play guitar. Like do open mic gigs at coffee shops or bars or wherever. In the Queens and Manhattan area. I didn't know that. And kind of his interest in music was something that I had some idea, but I think he was a classical guitar player. And then I think more kind of philosophically or psychologically, he almost had like some call it like an imposter syndrome, where he never, in many aspects, just didn't think he was that good or kind of felt like inadequate. Even when he was at Harvard Law. And like, to me, that seems crazy, because someone that smart, you're like, how could you ever feel inadequate? But, I think it goes to show you never know what's going on in someone's head. And, he was considered by so many like as this iconic comedian and as certainly a comics comic. To not feel like you were adequate seems completely ridiculous. But, that definitely surprised me.
Matt Balaker talking about Greg Giraldo. And I think sometimes for brilliant people, it's very difficult in their work when they know it could have been even better. We might think it's great, but they had something in their mind that they were trying to get to and couldn't quite do it. And I think that is endlessly frustrating for the brilliant ones. And obviously, Greg had a lot of personal problems, but it wasn't like he wasn't aware of them. Just because you know the battle that you're in doesn't mean that you're going to do that safe thing all the time. This is Andy Kindler talking about the fact that Greg was very self-reflective.
I'd known him for a long time, but we never were in the same scene together, kind of. So this was, it was pretty intense, and I got to spend so much time with him, at that point in his life. I had no idea what was going to happen, but I got I felt very close to him very fast. He first of all was so, I just can't get over how smart he was. And I mean it like in a way of being interesting too. He just was really, really, his mind work was really, really great. And, so it was so intense. It was so quick and it was so intense. And I didn't, he was just so funny. But also, because he was in the program and he was talking about the program, and he was thinking about himself a lot. He was going through things like, you could tell he was, but obviously it's so weird when what happened to him because then it affected me in such a weird way. I mean, it sounds like self-absorbed, but I didn't know him that well before then. But I'd always been someone who I admired, and then, like I was just watching some of his the midlife, what is it called, midlife vices, and just, I put it on. I haven't actually been able to watch anything since he passed away. I haven't been able to watch anything. I just and it's like I just realized I have not watched him since he died, and then I looked at it and it's like, gee, he just was back in the flesh.
This is Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy, and Andy Kindler talking about some of the struggles that Greg dealt with.
I didn't know the degree to which he had struggled with things, but like he would tell me about how in I think it's AA where he said, you want to have restraint of pen or something, restraint of pen. It's like this is like years before I went into different Twitter obsessive compulsive holes, where it's like, he could see how he was very astute about what he was going through and about the struggles of trying to be sober and all this kind of stuff. But he also had an amazingly great sense of humor about it at the same time. So it was just, it's just something in me feels like, he was so self-aware, and so present and so funny. You just can't reconcile the fact that he's gone. Kind of, it's like, I guess you just always have to remember that things like that happen, and the way I saw him was the way he was. He really was funny all the time, sarcastic all the time, and definitely thought about things. I think before that, I knew he was smart and everything, but you don't know somebody till you spend time with them. And I could just tell that he got the concepts of why he was trying to be sober, and he got the concepts of what was happening in his life. And like during the last comic standing, there was this one comic who did a set. I don't even remember the details about it, but the guy kind of did a set. Then he said, "Well, this isn't even the set I was going to do. I'm just, I don't even know why I'm here." And then Greg got really mad about it and basically was telling the guy, "Look, I've suffered in my life too. I've had, I've OD'd," and he's just telling me, like, started to tick off a list of things. And so he was just angry because he felt like the guy was using his real problems as kind of a examining tool for the audition. And so, like, that was an example where I saw him get really upset, and then he wasn't upset in the next second, but I could tell that there's a lot going on there, and you don't necessarily. He's so calm and so, in a way, collected. You don't see all the things that are going on. So it was just amazing. Obviously, in retrospect, since he passed away, it was really, really intense to think about it. I mean, I was at the Stress Factory like 2 weeks before he was. We were like going around the country on the base. I was getting a little bit more money at that time. I can show you the checks if you don't believe me. But we were from Last Comic Standing exposure, and so he kept leaving me notes and things like that. So it's just the whole thing became so weird to me and affected me. It just affected me deeply.
This is Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy. Greg had done an interview with Psychology Today, and it is such a tough read. And when you get in talking about success and this drive to perfection, if you look at Greg's life by most people's standards, TV and the stage and the admiration of his peers, it certainly appears to be a successful life. But when there's something going on inside, when you're struggling to find something else, it's much more complicated. And reading this, it was a really, really tough read. But I saw a lot of myself in this article in ways that I'm not able to talk about. And of course, friends of mine as well. So you saw Greg on this struggle, and he certainly knew right from wrong and good from bad, but it doesn't mean that you could get to all those places at that time. And this is Jim Norton talking a little bit about Greg's place in the business.
I remember when he died. Oh, of course you do. I was in Florida. I was doing a gig, a place called Captain Brian's or something like that. It's a gig I did not enjoy in Florida. You know, you were there on a stage, and there's all these weird, like, fucking buoys behind you and seafarer shit. It was an awful gig. But I got a call, and it was Vinnie Brand's daughter from the Stress Factory, and she was crying. And she goes, are you available tonight? It was a Saturday. And I'm like, well, no, I'm in Florida. She goes, because we need someone to come in and cover. Greg's in the hospital. Can you come in and do the show? She asked me to come in and do the late show. I think it might have been the early show. I don't remember. And no, it was the early show. And I said, I can't. I'm in Florida. And, that was when he had overdosed and gotten taken to Robert Wood Johnson. And it's sad, but it wasn't surprising. You know, when you know a guy is doing drugs and you know a guy can't put sobriety, it was like Mitch Hedberg, you know. It's always a devastating thing, and it makes you angry. Like, God damn it, dude. What the fuck, Greg? He was so good. And Giraldo also, I'm sorry I'm all over the place too, but Giraldo also had this way, like he made you hate the business in a way too, because he was so good and they could never find anything for him. Patrice too. There was never a place for these guys. Like Greg Giraldo got a lot of pilots and he did a lot of pilots, but none ever really took off. And it was like, God, how do you not find a place for that funny motherfucker, that prolific funny mother, or the Patrice? You know, I mean, the web junk thing kind of became Tosh.0 eventually. But how do you not find a place for these guys that is, like, how are they not iconic? They didn't die that young. I mean, Greg, I think, was in his 40s and Patrice was 41. I mean, they weren't 28 when they died. They weren't 25. So the fact that they couldn't find a place for it, you know, in the business, when we all look at ourselves like, hey, how come I'm not further along and say, well, look at these guys. They were both brilliant comedically, and they didn't find what they were supposed to be doing.
Jim Norton talking about Greg Giraldo. This is Vinnie Brand, a comedian and owner of the Stress Factory, who was with Greg the night that he passed away. And amazingly, many people think it may have been the funniest show that he had ever done. Vinnie Brand.
Giraldo was there a lot, and Giraldo was on early, meaning, you know, we were headlining Greg very early on. And that's a story that, you know, I mean, that guy had just really gotten to the point where he would break and had broken, you know, large. And it's not, I don't like to talk much about Giraldo because when that happened and how it happened was just such a tragic thing. And that last show he did was probably the best stand-up show. I mean, just an amazing show. And I walked him down to the hotel at 5:30 in the morning, and he was, a little bit out of it. And he said, "Did you record that show?" And I said, "No, I didn't record it. We only record if a comic asks." And he goes, "I think that's the best show I've ever had." And that was the last show he ever had. And the next day was really hard. We were in the green room waiting for him to come in. They called us and said, "Listen, you got to come down the Hyatt." And he never, it was already done. He passed away the following Thursday, but the damage had been done. And we had exchanged text messages that morning at about 10:30 because I got up early. I get up early no matter what time I go to bed. And he was doing a recovery show that day in the city. And I texted him and said, "Hey, I want to make sure you're okay and up and moving." And he said, "Yeah, I canceled the show." He goes, "The irony of doing that show would be too much." And that was the last time I really talked to him. But great guy. Brilliantly funny.
Vinnie Brand talking about the last show of Greg Giraldo. I want to point out to people, particularly young people, that the way Greg went out was the least interesting thing about his life. it's one of the more ordinary aspects of his life. And I know from when I was young, I would read bios about, Jim Morrison or Janis Joplin or Lenny Bruce and kind of obsess on that lifestyle. But it is common. It's very, very common. And this was not a common man. Greg Giraldo was a brilliant comedian. And the way he went out there, I don't know. I just saw the stats the other day. There's like 185 people a day that overdose and die in this country every single day. They said you could fill Yankee Stadium at the end of the year with the amount of people who OD. It's something that happens. The interesting thing to me about Greg Giraldo is his art, and I hope that you go out and check it out. And like I said, it's on YouTube. It's places that you can go and pick it up. And there's going to be a new biography on his life and times. And I'm going to let the author of that biography have the last word.
He deserves to be in the Mount Rushmore of stand-up comedy. And if you want to broaden comedy to sketch and film, maybe not. But when, given the last 35 years, maybe 40 years, kind of post Lenny Bruce, I mean, there's George Carlin, Joan Rivers. I mean, he's right up there. And I say that for a couple of reasons, but most importantly is he was topical and he would talk about like current events. But, now it's after, more than 7 years after his death. And his topical material is evergreen. I mean, if you listen to some of the stuff now about North Korea, it seems just as relevant as it did 10 years ago. I mean, he had bits from the early 2000s that still hold up well. And it wasn't just like, take my wife, please. It was current events driven material. And that's just beyond impressive to me. And I think he should be known as someone who made it. Because, in the roast, he was kind of lampooned as someone who kills pilots. But there was a reason he had so many pilots, because he was so damn good. And people would give him opportunities. So, yeah, I mean, he could have been more. But, I mean, he's right up there with Chris Rock, Louis C.K., say Joan Rivers. I'm a big fan of her. I think, if I don't like lists, but if you're forced to make one, he's got to be the greatest, top 5 in the last 35 years. And by greatest, I mean, he could take a room, and you've probably seen this, of people who might not have even been there to see him. They weren't necessarily Greg Giraldo fans going in, and entertain them and make them laugh and make them think and just have a hell of a good time. And I think he could do that better than pretty much anyone I've seen.
This has been Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy. I want to thank a lot of the comedians. Well, I want to thank all the comedians that were part of this show, and to also point out one more time that a great deal of these guys are in recovery themselves, including the host of this show. So any of us could have had a last show anywhere and died in some hotel room. Again, that's not the most interesting thing about Greg. Go out, search out his work. Certainly, we're all looking forward to the new biography. But let me thank Colin Quinn, Dave Attell, Jim Gaffigan, Tom Papa, Lisa Lampanelli, Jim Norton, Nick DiPaolo, Robert Kelly, Rich Voss, Jim Florentine, Vinnie Brand, Andy Kindler, and Matt Balaker, the author of the upcoming book about Greg Giraldo. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you go and search out his work. And this has been Greg Giraldo, A Life in Comedy.